Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. On this episode, we are finally wrapping up this 5-lug swap on the Thunderbird, our Project 88 Ford Thunderbird Sport. Let's get into it. Okay, before we get into it, there's a couple housekeeping things we got to cover because you'll notice this episode kind of jumps around between different things we were going to do with the rear end, and there's a reason for that. Some used parts we got were bad. Some things the internet said were not true. I know, shocker. And it's just been like 4 months of debacle, 3 or 4 months. We haven't driven this thing since September, end of September. It's now the end of January 2021, but a lot of things going on. Moving, I have kind of worked around stuff in the shop again and moved stuff around. I've been working on the 69 F100, been working on the wife's Mustang, and I have picked up a new project for me for 2021 that you're gonna wanna see. If you are a Ford truck guy, it is the bucket list hot rod Ford truck build, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, what you're gonna see is kind of a mishmash because plan A was insert 5-lug axles into my stock Thunderbird rear end and reuse the drums. That didn't work. Could have re-drilled the drums, would have been expensive. Plan B was fitting the disc brakes and 5-lug axles from an SN car, a 96 Mustang, to this rear end. That didn't work. Despite what the internet says, the axle shafts do not fit. Now, if you have an 8.8 rear end, I don't know. Maybe they do. This 7.5 inch rear end, the 96 Mustang 7.5 inch rear axles do not fit it because the axle tubes are longer on the Thunderbird rear end. The axle shaft will not fully seat into the bearing and get the C-clip in. It won't happen. I tried it and it took a while to figure out what was going on. So now what we have is a junk axle that I got from the junkyard out of a 96 Mustang, 2.73 open, that was hammered. I mean, the bearings were all shot. So this car only has like 60,000 miles on it, not even. So the rear end was mint. So I took all the guts out of that one, rebuilt and put it into that one because this was a 2.73 limited slip rear end, and I want to keep the highway gear because this is my GT car. This is a cruiser. This I want to be able to set the cruise at like 80 plus on the interstate and just cruise. That's what this car is for. So now the rebuilt Mustang rear end is in there along with my 2001 Mustang GT wheels and used tires. So let's get into showing you the whole debacle that led us to here, and we'll show you what finally is that actually works. These brakes are just fine. They're in great shape, but the problem is I measured this center of the axle hub flange, and that is where the drum center's up on. Not so much the lug studs because there's some play there. This is like 2.5. The center register there on the disc brake axles is like 2 3/4. And you can't have those machined out. And I know it's not that hard to do, but the place locally said that they would, to re-drill the lug pattern, would have to like put it on their CNC, and it would be like $500 to set it up. So anyway, I think I figured out a better way, and we're gonna find out. So anyway, is that doable? Yes, absolutely. Is it practical? Not really. I also looked into buying Ranger drums because I've been told you could do that, but these are 10-inch drums, and from what I could find, there is not a bolt-on 5-lug 10-inch drum for like this application. I have all my disc brake parts over here, you can see. Okay, here's the other half of the equation. A 7.5 inch rear end out of a 96 Mustang from the junkyard, disc brake, 5-lug axle, 28 spline. 273 gear, so nothing gained there. Same gears that I already have, and I already have a 7.5. Before you throw a bunch of shade on me in the comments for what I plan for the car, this will be just fine. And 8.8s around here, especially a 5-lug one, are just, you just can't find them. So unless you want to pay about $600 and get one shipped in from a junkyard and still don't know what you have and might have to rebuild it, no thanks. Because that guy has like a 58,000 mile rear end in it that's just fine. What we're going to find out now is I got to looking, and these 4 bolts here, where the backing plate and all that stuff bolts on, the caliper mount, looks to be the same as the stock ones on that, where the backing plate for the drum bolts on. And you think, why would they change that? Because then they'd have to make a new bracket on the end of the axle tube. I bet it probably is the same. So there's those 4 bolts, and then this kind of stiffener deal clamps on there. So we're going to take all that crap off, along with those axles and some new seals, and see if we can just slam her all in there. Pro tip is, if you need a little bit more room, let the axle droop down. But I should be able to get it with my wobbly socket. Maybe not the top one. Here is the rear end tag. It's hard to look at this through the camera. 2L73. L is for locking, so this is a limited slip 273 rear end. I did not know that. I figured it was open. I am gonna have to get some additive or some different gear oil than what I have. Okay, come on now. Hip-ja! Hip-ja! Well, there you go. These are known to just break too, kind of during normal service, especially if the spider or the cross pin gets a little sloppy. The pinion shaft, they also call it, which is this guy right here, which is what we're going to take out. I have pulled out several of these and just found them broken, which then it gets interesting. This one, thankfully, is not. We're gonna have to turn it a little bit to get it out. So that's what she should look like. Sometimes you'll pull it out and only get half of it. That's what she said. Okay, now you can see the pinion shaft is already fallen out, so just go ahead and ease that on out. So now what we're gonna do is push in on each of our axle shafts, like so. And then, boy, I'll try to get you in there with my phone. You see, now we gotta get the C-clips out. There goes one. Okay, and then you simply slide it out. It's not a bad idea to have a rag. You kind of wipe it as you go because it's going to be coated with oil, so that way you don't make a big mess. And you can see right here, here's the splines where it engages the side gears in the differential, and this is the slot right there that the C-clip goes into. Non-C-clip axles won't have those, like Ford 9-inch, because they're retained by a flange down at the axle. So now the question is, will the disc brake brackets bolt on here, and are the axle shafts the same length as far as like the offset for the rotor hat? Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to tear down the old drum brakes off of the back. I already have this side done, and I started to mock it up with the 5-lug axle and caliper bracket, which the caliper bracket does bolt right on there. The only question is basically the depth or the offset correct for the length of these axle tubes. So That's what we're going to find out, but I will show you once you have the drum off. Once you have the drum off, this is what you're looking at. First thing we need to do is get the e-brake cable popped out of here. And if you're clever, you can just do it with a screwdriver. Yep, see that's free there? You just have to push the spring back and it comes out of there. And then there's these tabs here, which we need to depress so that we can pop them back in like that. You gotta fight it a little bit. Pull it out like so. Oh yeah. Okay, now we unhook the brake line, zip these 4 bolts out, and the whole thing is just going to come off. Alright. Some people are intimidated by drum brakes. I've done plenty of them, but if you do it this way, you just unhook the brake line from the back. I have it clamped off up there so it doesn't leak all over the place. You just e-brake cable, brake line, those 4 nuts, and then she just comes right off like that. Don't have to mess with springs or any of that stuff. So we need to go ahead and get that seal out of there because it is not the right size. So here's a little trick for axle seals if you don't have like a tomahawk puller, which those things are awesome by the way. Take your axle shaft after you slide it out, hook it in one side, and just use it as a big lever. Just that easy. There you go. Okay, now we can throw our new disc brake backing plate on here. Caliper bracket, whatever you want to call it. And we'll just zip down these nuts. Now don't yell at me because it's all greasy and there's no seal in there. This is just for mock-up for now, since this is all experimental. Okay. Good enough for now. We're just going to slide our 5-lug axle shaft in there for mock-up. And we'll get the C-clips in and try to fit the brakes on there and see how that goes. Okay, at this point I figured out that there's no way the 5-lug axles are ever going to fit in the stock Thunderbird housing, despite what the internet says, and that's because while the axles are exactly the same length, the 5-lug axles are not machined down on the bearing surface as far down to the flange as the 4-lug axles are. This won't let them seat all the way into the axle tube. So with that being figured out, I moved on to stripping the Mustang axle housing so that it can be rebuilt using the parts from the Thunderbird axle, which are still good. Okay, before I go tearing the caps out, you can see here I cleaned them off and I stamped a 2 on that cap there, 2 there. They already have an arrow that shows you which way is out. 1 there, 1 there. I'll show you real quick why we're not using any of the guts from this rear end. So I'll spin it over here and you can see that this is open. There's no spring in there. There's no clutches on the sides. And I could hear quite a bit of racket when I turned the pinion. I thought it was gear lash. Well, it's not. It's all moving now. I don't know if you can see that, but the carrier bearings in this thing are wasted. So that stuff's all junk. And again, I'm not doing the assembly and stuff on this, but I'm just doing a favor for the guy who is by marking things as I take it apart. And I'm stripping it for him because this is just meathead work and stuff that I can get out of the way so that he doesn't have to do it. Yeah, that should definitely fit tighter than that in there. Shims that go on the side. Now the only thing really we have left is the pinion gear, and we'll clean out the inside of the housing a little bit for him. So we will zip those back in real quick, flip it over, knock the pinion out, and we are almost done. Okay, so here is a bare housing, hosed out with a couple cans of brake clean, and that's what it looked like. I didn't show you, but I also knocked out the pinion bearing races because we're not going to reuse any of the junk. All we're using on this is the housing and the caps, and then eventually, obviously, we're going to use the brakes when we put it back in the car. So next, yanking that rear out of the car, and then we're going to get this crap loaded up and head to town to go drop it off to the guy. There's all the guts. Carrier, pinion, races, pinion bearing, oil slinger, and it doesn't look like there's anything wrong with the housing. You can see just these pinion bearings. Of course, they're not loaded right now, but they are totally wasted. So I wasn't interested in using any of that junk. And as I said before, open differential, no fun. This thing has a tight posi in it, so we definitely want to keep on that. Okay, so we have our junkyard rear end out of a 96 V6 Mustang. It was in such bad shape, it does have the guts from the Thunderbird 7.5-inch rear end. But what we're gonna do, I've got it all prepped and cleaned up, new axle bearings, center's completely rebuilt, new seals, same gears, same diff from the Thunderbird. But basically we're gonna start with pressing in the upper axle bushings here that go at the top.
Yep.
This is what they look like new. The original ones had a shoulder, I believe, where it would stop as you were pressing it in. They make a special tool that will actually stop when it's supposed to, or for $1 and crap you have laying around, you can make your own. So what I have here is, I've got a big 10 mil bolt, some kind of suspension bolt with washers on it. Make sure the washers are big enough that they are bigger than the rubber on the bushing. Otherwise it will try to pull the rubber right out of the shell. And I went and measured the old rear end to see kind of how the bushings were offset in there. They're not actually centered, so I have like this 1.5-inch piece of pipe or whatever that it's a little big, but you can see it slips over the bushing. So what I'm gonna do is put this in one side with a little anti-seize on there, put this on the other side with some washers and a nut, and I'll use this to draw the bushing into the housing. Now I made this 3/4 of an inch because the stick out that I measured of the bushing shell on the old rear end to the inside stuck out 1/2 inch. Not as much on the flange side, it was only like 3/8 on the flange side, but now the rubber and sleeve and all that sticks out a little further, so I made that 3/4 because this stuff sticks out 1/4, so that way it will stop when the sleeve is protruding 1/2 inch. In theory anyway. Let's see. Okay, so that all worked right until we got about 1/4 inch away from where it needed to be all the way in, and then we started breaking bolts and stripping nuts, and it just will not go anymore. So after failing at this, we've now rented the parts store ball joint press, and the cup they give you is just a little bit too long, so you can't quite get the right angle on there. My spacer that I had laying around is a little too long too, but it's better. So we're gonna give this a try and see if we can get that last 1/4 inch. And if we can, then we'll go ahead and go on to the other side. We'll see if this works. Okay, as you can see, that worked much better, so just do that from the start next time. Unfortunately, that's going to have to do it for this episode. Shortly after I got the rear end set in the car, I ran into some snags with the brake lines and fittings. I got sick. It dropped about 2 feet of snow outside, and the temperature also dropped to the negative double digits right now. So I do have merch in to give away. I'm going to wait to do that until I'm better because I don't want to spread my germs around, so I'm not touching any of that stuff right now. You're going to want to stay tuned. I have 2 big boxes of parts for the Mustang. I'll be wrapping up this 5-lug swap and finishing up a few things on the Thunderbird. I will get back to work on the 460 in the next couple weeks, and I also have a new project to reveal, but I'm kind of waiting for some things to fall into place before I get into that. So stay tuned for that. You're going to want to see that. Good stuff coming up. Thanks again for liking, watching, sharing, and subscribing. I'll see you guys again when I'm feeling better.